this webinar. There is a project called Law in the Time of COVID-19 between Univali, Brazil, and Widener University, Delaware Law School, United States. The specific theme of this week is environmental law, and our speakers are two great professors from each university, specialists in the theme because they research it, have written works about it, books and articles, and teach the discipline at several levels. Thus, I have the great opportunity to present or reintroduce from the United States, Professor James May. James R. May is Distinguished Professor of Law and co-founder and co-director of the Dignity Rights Project and the Environmental Rights Institute at Widener University, Delaware Law School. May is also adjunct professor of graduate engineering and inaugural and immediate past chief sustainability officer at Widener University, where he founded the Widener Sustainability Initiative. He has advised numerous governments, governmental organizations, and institutions on constitutionalism, including here in Brazil. May is also a certified engineer from formerly worked in national defense. Well, and speaking here from Florianópolis, Santa Catarina, Brazil, Professor Dr. Marcelo Buzago Dantas. Marcelo Buzago Dantas is one of the first attorneys entirely devoted to environmental law in Brazil and has almost 25 years of experience in the field. He has received an LLM and an SJD in diffuse and collective rights from the Pontifícia Universidade Católica de São Paulo and was a visiting scholar of the environmental law program at Pace University School of Law in White Plains, New York. And in 2015, a scholar in residence at Widener University, Delaware School. He has a postdoctorate in environmental law, transnationality, and sustainability from the Univali. He is a well-known environmental law professor in Brazil, teaching and convening courses in various universities through the country. From 2013 to 2019, he has figured in the list of the British publication, Who is Who Legal Environment. The CVs are much larger, and I'm making a difficult synthesis, sorry. Are you okay, professors?
Perfect.
Great. You received in advance, and you already know the rules, and I just ask you to watch the time and to try to speak loudly and not too quickly, okay? Because our audience has people at various levels of English. So I ask for a brief presentation of each one to situate ourselves in relation to the topic, okay? Then we will move on to the discuss of ideas and possible debates on the topic. Professor James May, or Jimmy, you have the floor, please.
Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good day to everybody. It's such a pleasure to be a part of this. Thank you to our friends at Univali and Delaware Law School for hosting this. And it's a real pleasure to be on this panel with my very good friend, Professor Dantas, and also my friend, Judge Jacobsen. So thank you. And thanks everyone for joining. My talk is about environmental policy in the United States during the pandemic. And it's not a pretty picture. So I'll just get right to it. And so during the time of the pandemic, and while the United States and the world sort of reels from the coronavirus, there have been various rollbacks to federal environmental laws. So during this period of time, over the last 3 months, the Trump administration has taken steps to roll back environmental laws that are bedrock to law in the United States, including laws concerning or keeping our air clean, our water drinkable, protecting animals, and providing for public health. And also taking measures to combat climate change. So in the last 3 months, the Trump administration has taken a variety of steps to roll back these environmental laws. And so what I'm going to do in the time that I have is just provide some examples of that in a chronology of sorts. And I'll begin in January, at which time we've recently learned the Trump administration first learned about the coronavirus. So in early January, the administration announced a plan. This is first. The administration announced a plan to gut what was our nation's very first environmental law, and arguably the first national environmental law in the world. It's called the National Environmental Policy Act, and it was put into place by the Nixon administration. And its purpose is to require that there be an environmental analysis of major federal projects like dams or coal-fired power plants or major highways or things like that. So with the Trump administration, the problem it has with this law called NEPA is that it argues that it makes projects more expensive and slows down project implementation primarily by the fossil fuel industry. And more recently, that's by requiring that there be an assessment of impacts on climate change. So for some time, the American fossil fuel industry, like the American Petroleum Institute and others, have been pushing the Trump administration to amend this law. And in January, the Trump administration issued new rules to do just that. And then when the lockdowns began in the United States, when people stayed at home and kids were sent home from school and schools closed and America got very, very quiet, the Trump administration refused attempts or requests to extend the comment period to that rule. And then on January 23rd, the administration set its sights, secondly, on the Clean Water Act and a law that has been on the books since 1972 that keeps our waters safe. And this new rule by the Trump administration would dramatically restrict the kinds of waters that the Clean Water Act protects. The rule would exclude any kind of water body that is rain dependent and countless wetlands and ponds. And so that means that those waters would no longer be protected under federal law. And then 1 week later, on January 30th, the Trump administration announced drastic changes to a law that protects migratory birds. And this change would allow the killing of millions of birds. And that, again, that others had been asking the Trump administration, a change that others had been asking the Trump administration to make long before the pandemic. But the Trump administration moved forward with this change. It had a public comment period, again, that happened to fall right in the middle of lockdowns that it refused to extend. And then in March, on March 26th, that is at a point when the majority of the states in the United States had announced stay-at-home orders because of the severity of the coronavirus. The Trump administration announced that it would no longer be enforcing limits on pollution emissions into the air, and that it would no longer be inspecting major sources of air pollution. This, in essence, amounts to a license to pollute, but it resulted from a letter and a request by the American Petroleum Institute that the Trump administration answered favorably to the fossil fuel industry. And then roughly a week after that, it just keeps coming. And then roughly a week after that, at a time when every state in the United States had lockdown orders in place, on March 31st of this year, the Trump administration announced that it would be relaxing standards for automobiles that were put into place during the Obama administration to make cars more fuel efficient. So the Trump administration announced that it would be rolling those standards back so that cars wouldn't have to be as efficient. A new report just on that alone predicts that that would result in almost 20,000 premature deaths within the next couple of decades, and cost consumers upwards of $300 billion. And so the fossil fuel industry stands to benefit from savings from not having to meet those new standards. Now, this rollback, the Environmental Defense Fund has reported, is expected to add 1.5 billion metric tons of climate gases into the atmosphere. So next, just a couple of weeks later, on April 14th, the Trump administration, just a week before Earth Day, mind you, announced that it was refusing to lower the legal limit for very small particles of pollution in the air that are primarily emitted by the fossil fuel industry. And it did that even over the recommendation of its own EPA, Environmental Protection Agency scientists. So specifically, the Trump administration declined to lower the national standard for what's called particulate matter, the most widespread and deadly air pollutant in the United States. So it's emitted by power plants and cars and factories. Because it's so small, it can get embedded deep into the lungs and causes respiratory problems, which are, of course, exacerbated by the pandemic. And then 2 days later, on April 16th, and just a few days before Earth Day, the Trump administration announced that it was finalizing a rule to undermine protections against mercury pollution. And these mercury pollution standards that the Obama administration put into place would regulate emissions from the coal and oil and gas industries that also can be harmful to lungs and damage the neurological system, which especially affects kids, the elderly, and the infirm. Now, all of these rollbacks have had a particularly concerning effect on people of color and communities of color in the United States, which tend to live disproportionately next to polluting facilities and suffer most acutely and have the least access to fresh air and clean water and health services. But that's not all. During the time of when the world was marking the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, the Trump administration continued to take measures to open up federal lands that right now are being occupied and repopulated by wildlife because people aren't permitted in them at the moment. But the Trump administration announced that it would open them up to development, namely 150,000 acres across southern Utah, and also thousands of acres in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to oil and gas development. And it would open up some of the nation's last remaining uncut forests in Alaska, in the Tongass National Forest, to a massive amount of timber harvesting. And it would allow a proposed mine, a pebble mine, little stones, to move forward, even though it would decimate the world's largest fishery of wild sockeye salmon. And that's not all. And just very recently, the Trump administration said or announced that it was moving ahead with a rule that would limit the use of peer-reviewed scientific studies to try to set public health standards, which will have adverse effects, again, primarily on people in communities of color, the elderly, the infirm, and on children. So there is one other countervailing story in everything that's happening during the pandemic, and that's primarily about pollution. There's a lot less of it. Pollution levels, depending upon who you believe and whatnot, are down 30 to 50% in the United States. Rivers are cleaner, air quality is better, but the Trump administration is already making moves to make up for lost time, to put people back to work, but without limiting the amount of pollution that can be generated, which will just result in more detrimental effect on public health and the environment in the months to come after restrictions are relaxed. So this is a reprieve for a few months for the world, for nature, but it will be reversed in due time. And that's a recap of what's been happening in the United States in the field of environmental law during the pandemic. Thank you. Gilson, you might be on mute.
Thank you, Professor May. Thank you very much. Professor Marcelo Dantas, now it's your turn. You have the floor, please.
Well, thank you very much, Gilson, for the presentation, for moderating this panel. I'd like to thank Professor James May. It's a huge honor for me to be here discussing this important issue with Professor May, who is an international well-known scholar and a very close friend. And James May, someone I learned to admire. And our friendship actually became a partnership between our two institutions, Univali and Delaware law. And that's why we have been able to do things like that. Make discussions, exchange ideas, and talk to students there in the US and here in Brazil. So thanks very much, Jimmy, for everything. I'd also like to thank Professor Paul Reagan, Professor Erin Daly, both from Delaware Law School, for joining this project with us from Univali. I think it's been a great opportunity for us and for our students to have an idea of what's going on in specific points of view during this pandemic, and especially after it ends, and we all hope it ends soon. So thanks very much, and thank you again, Professor Gilson, my colleague, my friend, my partner in many projects, for doing this moderation. So it was very, very interesting. It's always very nice to hear Professor May, and he gave an interesting view of what's happening in the U.S. concerning environmental protection and these rows back actually that are happening there. Actually, this is not happening here in Brazil up to now. I don't know if the Bolsonaro administration has other problems, if the president is worried about other issues. But the thing is that the environment hasn't been, something that has been treated during the pandemic. There is a decision from the Secretary of State concerning the application of the Atlantic Forest Law versus the Forest Code, which is somehow polemic, controversial, but that's it by now. We haven't had so many situations in Brazil as there has been in the US. I have listed some topics I'd like to talk about very shortly, very briefly, so that we can have the participation of the audience with questions and comments. The first issue I'd like to point out is concerns the new challenges that environmental protection will face during and after the pandemic. Because obviously this pandemic is going to generate a lot of problems, huge problems. It has been already, actually. So economic problems, poverty, unemployment, violence, starvation, etc. So the society in general, not only government, but everyone will have to face these clash of fundamental rights that are very common when we talk about environmental law. But that will become more and more frequent, I believe, during and after this pandemic. So the necessity of balancing rights like dignity, like the right to live, like social and economic development, and the environment will be a reality, as it is already, but probably even more. And then, in the situation we're facing, probably there is a huge tendency, in my opinion, that environmental protection will be at risk. Of course, it seems to me very obvious that in a clash like that, in the situation we're going to face, courts and agencies will probably overcome environmental rights for other rights. So, and it's something that, well, actually, we have just, after around almost 50 years of building this environmental law, and Jimmy talked about NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which is a very important act, not only for the United States, but for the whole world. Actually, we have our NEPA in Brazil, which is dated from 1981. So it's been a long time that we have been building this environmental law. And now environmental law, in my opinion, will have to be rebirth, and it will have to adopt itself with other, with a different situation we have never faced. The second topic, I would like to talk a little about federalism, and especially about the authority to edit acts, norms, rules, and regulation. And why is that? Because in Brazil, differently from the US, totally differently, although our federation is inspired in the US Federation, what happened here was different. Because as Natami said last week, differently from the United States, we in Brazil were a colony and we became independent from Portugal, and then we created our states. And it is different in America, as everybody knows. The states decided to join and create the federal union. So what does it mean? It means that here in Brazil, states don't have much autonomy in any area, but in environmental protection terms, this is very real, and it has always been. It has always been a fact that in Brazil, the main power is with the federal government, not with the states. The states had limited power to issue rules and regulations historically. And the Supreme Court in Brazil has always banned state acts, state rules, state statutes that were contrary to the federal rules. Although many people were against that, although many respected authors defended the opposite, defended historically as well that when it comes to environmental protection, states and also municipalities can edit rules that are more strict in favor of environmental protection. But that has never been the position of the Supreme Court. And of course, we don't have much time here, but you just have to remember the examples of asbestos, the commercialization of asbestos, the prohibition. Some states tried to impose, and the Supreme Court said no, because there is a federal rule that says that asbestos are permitted in the country, and this was in the past. Now it's no longer permitted, but anyway, it's a tendency that has been reviewed in this case. In the case of GMOs, genetically modified organisms, in the case of the burn of sugarcane straw. So historically, the Supreme Court never allowed states or municipalities to impose stricter rules, even in favor of environmental protection. And now during this pandemic, and that's a parallel because the Supreme Court 2 weeks ago was not talking about environmental protection, but it was talking about something similar. And the Supreme Court said that states could impose harder rules in order to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. By all, that was an opinion issued by all of its members. And so it's something totally different from what has ever happened. And now we don't know if this reviews a revolution, let's say, in the Supreme Court jurisprudence, or the alarming situation has contributed to that. Third topic, and I don't know if I have how much time I still have, Gilson. 5 minutes?
No. Yes.
All right. So yeah, I will be quick. The precautionary principle. I have been criticizing the use of the precautionary principle in Brazil for many years, because I believe that different from what happens in America or in the European Union, we have distorted the noble goal of the precautionary principle. Sometimes because we're using the precautionary principle when there's no risk at all. Other times because when there's no uncertainty or the risks exist, but they're none. So we're talking about prevention or precaution. We have used the precautionary principle as a basis, as justification for the inversion of the burden of proof in class actions, which in my opinion is totally wrong, with respect to those who think differently. Because if we're talking about uncertainty, if you invert or not, I mean, it's impossible to prove because it's uncertain. But anyway, why do I want to talk about the precautionary principle in this case, in this topic of COVID-19? Because this is, in my opinion, a real case where the applicability of the precautionary principle has a place to be used, because now nobody knows much about this virus. Nobody knows how this virus will behave in Brazil. Will it behave the same as it did in Italy or in Spain or in the United States of America? Or maybe here it won't be that bad. We don't know. We don't know anything. So we use the precaution. And if you can, you stay at home. This is precaution. And last, licensing. I talk in two senses of licensing, and then I promise I end, Gilson and Jimmy and the audience. Well, we can't bear anymore not to have clear rules about licensing in Brazil. This very important mechanism of environmental policy has never been treated by Congress in Brazil. Never, ever. The only time Congress mentioned environmental licensing in the law is in our NEPA in 1981. Never again. So I believe that this pandemic is, well, we didn't need the pandemic for that, but since we have this pandemic, we're facing this pandemic, there should be an approval of the Act of Environmental Licensing that has been in Congress for over 15 years. It's more than time for Congress to approve it, or at least to discuss it and reach a final statute. And lastly, well, some states in the country, like Santa Catarina did today, as Rio Grande do Sul has done recently, some states have postponed the validity of licenses. In Santa Catarina case, it was for 4 months. So licenses that were to lose their efficacy now during the pandemic would have this validity postponed for 4 more months due to the difficulty of the agencies to inspect sites and enterprises. So that's another effect of the pandemic. So thank you very much. I hope actually we should have a series of environmental law during COVID-19, because there are so many things. We haven't talked about climate change. We haven't talked about sanitation, water. Well, there are so many other things we could talk about, but the time is limited. So I thank you very much for hearing. And I give the word back to Professor Gilson. Thanks, Gilson.
Thank you, dear Professor Marcelo Dantas. Thank you, both speakers. Now is the time for both professors to be able to bring to the debate specific points about the impact of COVID-19, if you want, and the students, alumni, professors, audience in general, to make questions, of course. To ask questions, sorry. Who wants to start? Professor James May, you'd like to speak, isn't it? Professor Marcelo Dantas?
Yeah.
Oh, Jimmy.
If there's no question, still there's no question from the students, I'd like to ask Professor May if you can talk a little more about the impact on climate change. Do you believe that this pandemic has contributed to environmental protection? How do you think things will be after it ends, and whatever you'd like to talk about?
Sure. Thank you. I really appreciated your comments, and especially this is a very particular time, right? We can learn so much about what's happening during the pandemic. You know, systems show what they're worth, as do relationships in times of stress. And with climate change, it's still a crisis. It's still happening. It will still be happening after this crisis is over. But there are two sort of silver linings. One is that what's happened during the pandemic shows that collective action can help and be effective. It shows that if the world sees a threat, that it can not necessarily come together, but that there can be collective action to address that threat. And climate change is a pandemic for the planet. It's just the time frame is different. Climate change has infected the planet. It will affect all ecosystems in the planet, all living beings. It will change geography. It will change psychology and sociology, and it will change the very nature of existence on the earth. So, what to do about that? Well, one thing to do is to look at climate change as a problem that has solutions, just like we're trying to find for the coronavirus in this short period of time. We're trying to figure out if there can be a vaccine. We're trying to keep safe distances. We're trying to keep people safe and respect the equal worth of every human being, which is an essential component of human dignity, the very purpose of existence, one might say. So that suggests that we have the capacity to take collective action to address the climate crisis. The other silver lining, and it's short-lived, is what I mentioned earlier, is that greenhouse gas emissions worldwide have plummeted. And many countries actually look for the very first time this year will meet their greenhouse gas emission goals. Germany, for example, has already announced that it expects to meet the goals that it agreed to abide by with the Paris Climate Accord. So that, as I mentioned earlier, is short-lived because when the pandemic lifts, airlines and power stations and the petrochemical industry and pharmaceuticals and factories and businesses all across the world will get going again, and people will go back to work, and there'll be, pent up interest in production. And the Trump administration has said that we will produce our way out of this crisis at the other end of it, and that will take an enormous environmental toll, and that in the long run doesn't do any good for climate change. So those are my thoughts about the impacts of the pandemic on climate change in the long term, with some hope there, and in the short term with a silver lining, but with a very dark cloud looming on the other end of this phase.
Thank you. We already have some questions, okay?
Great.
There is one formulated by Diego. He would like to hear from professors if the environmental principles could be used to face this pandemic as a general rule.
Jimmy, would you like to start?
No, go ahead, Marcelo. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think so. I think the precautionary principle, as I said, polluter pays principle as well. Unfortunately, the protector receiver principle, which is something we were working on and building here in Brazil lately, will probably have to wait a little more. The principle, as you all know, is in our legislation, and it means that those who protect the environment receives a compensation for that, for the ecosystem services they make. Unfortunately, the economic crisis that we are already facing will leave the application of this principle for a future that we hope it's not so far. That's it in general.
Thank you. Guilherme has a question too. Let me see. The question on climate change. Can this pandemic's lockdown create a different point of view on how to diminish climate change or not?
Marcelo, should I begin?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Okay. Great question. Thank you. And for the other one as well about international environmental principles, those are great questions. So on climate change, I think it can. I think it can have a normative effect. I don't know the translation of that in Portuguese, but I think that what's happening can change human behavior. I mean, what we've learned is that we don't have to travel as much. There are conferences now are occurring virtually, which will cut down on air travel, which accounts for almost 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions. We're teaching virtually, which will also cut down on commuting and the energy costs for heating and lighting classrooms, and result various energy savings. Many people are eating more healthy foods because restaurants and fast food establishments are closed. So it can have, and all sorts of other positive impacts on human health and the environment. It can have that effect. It remains to be seen whether those changes will hold, whether a year from now or 2 or 10 years from now, there will be a change in human behavior that will result in reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. One can only hope.
Can I say a few words about this?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, I totally agree with Jimmy. And well, this pandemic has lots of cons, but I hope that there is one pro, which is changing our mentality, the human being mentality of what's really important in life. And if we start thinking, you can change your life in different ways. Like you don't need to travel that much. You don't need to use your car that much. You don't need a new iPhone every year. You need more time with your family. You need to practice sports. You need to walk. And I believe that these, and that's another question, and answering the other question that is going to be posed, I think so, that individually we can make a change. And the pandemic is horrible. It's killing many people around the world. But let's take some advantage of it. And that's the, I mean, I haven't gone to a gas station since the pandemic started. I haven't filled my car. So, and do I need to use the car that much? Do I need to travel that? I mean, talking personally, but any of us has specificities and things that we have changed during the pandemic. So let's use this time for a change. And we can definitely help in a different way of living and helping with the environment to protect the environment for the future generations. That's what I think.
Okay, thank you. Douglas Fontana also brings us a question. Professors, how do you understand Roger Scruton ideas of local and individual responsibilities for ecological preservation?
Marcelo, why don't you begin? Thank you.
Sorry?
If you could begin.
Yeah, well, actually, it was what I was talking about. I think so. I think it can, we can individually, we can help with building a new era. And actually, as we were talking yesterday, Gilson, Jimmy, Erin, and I, everybody could predict. I mean, this pandemic was predictable, totally predictable. Many people thought this could happen. We didn't know how, we didn't know the dimension, but we could predict it. But what did we do? In Brazil, an underdevelopment country, we built stadiums for a World Cup. And the former president said, quote, we don't make a World Cup with hospitals. And now these hospitals will save lives, not the football stadiums. So I think it's time for a real change. And we have learned by the worst way, which is seeing our friends, seeing our people dying for a virus that we don't know and we were not prepared to face.
Thank you. There is another one.
Jimmy, would you like to?
Sorry, Jimmy.
Yeah, no, I think, again, another terrific question. And I saw, I was able to see a couple of other questions, and I think they're related, so I'll just comment on them together. And yeah, I think that really it requires a different way of thinking about how environmental law works. And really, environmental law is, and we use this word environment, but we're really talking about, for the most part, protecting people and protecting species and providing for biodiversity and a sustainable future for the next generations to come. But our environmental laws in the United States really aren't designed to do that. I mean, it's sort of like the metaphor would be our laws, if they were a car, they're not designed to float. They're not designed to be in water. But so the environmental laws that we're operating under now, most of them were made 50 years ago, a long, long time ago, nearly. And the way to think about environmental law going forward, I believe anyway, is to value um, human lives the way that we're talking about valuing them in the time of the pandemic. So the pandemic reminds us of our equal worth and what we mean to each other. So one way to go forward in reimagining environmental law, at least in the United States, is to change the point of departure, that the beginning point for law ought to be that. It ought to be protecting and respecting human dignity, and then building laws around that concept. Now, under the Brazilian constitutional system, there's more leeway to do just that sort of thing, because the Brazilian constitution is much more sophisticated about environmental rights and socioeconomic rights. So the Brazilian constitution, I invite a reimagining there. It'd be easier than in the United States, but globally, it's something to think about, which leads to the second question that I saw, which is, does one imagine a delay in the implementation of or development of international environmental laws because of the pandemic? And I think that that's probably true. The pandemic is having a delaying effect on all sorts of activities, including at the international level, to address environmental challenges. On the other hand, it's been a real struggle over the last decade plus to develop new treaties to address developing environmental challenges like climate change. We still don't have an international agreement that's enforceable to reduce greenhouse gases. The United States still doesn't have a climate change act or policy. So again, this kind of collective action and thinking about how we treat each other and about how we're all in this together maybe can help contribute to that. But on the other hand, there are these challenges because our economy in the United States is so built around development and fossil fuels. Just right now, today, there are tankers, 8 tankers on their way or en route, some of which are already off ports of California, bringing oil that the United States doesn't need. There's an oil glut in the United States, but countries are still producing it because there's still this dependency. So that is just sort of an invitation for when the pandemic is over to engage in, sort of a wild party of oil and natural gas and fossil fuel consumption to put people back to work. And I think ultimately that's something to be concerned about, because at this present point, oil is free.
Thank you so much. Rômulo Francisco Rendes dos Santos wants to know, can we see a conflict of sustainability dimensions when we look to the lockdown against or versus economic health?
Can I?
Yes, please.
We definitely can. Definitely. And, well, this is an issue in Brazil. As the audience know, our president is totally against any restriction. Our president, since the beginning, and that's his difference from Donald Trump, because Donald Trump has this position in the beginning, and then when he saw so many people dying, he changed. But Bolsonaro didn't change. Bolsonaro, since the beginning, he defended that people would have to go to work. People should work because the economy, otherwise, he said, people will die, not for the virus, but from unemployment, from starvation. There is a clash, of course. There is a clash, and what do we do when there is a clash? What I have defended from since many years, that when there is a clash of fundamental rights, you have to balance. You have to use proportionality, and through an argument, you have to decide which right should prevail. In this case, we're facing reveals a clash. And some states are privileging public health, instead of the economy, but not the federal government. Well, not the president, let's say. Not the president, because both secretaries of state, health secretaries, the former one and the new one they have not defended the same measures. They're talking about lockdown. I mean, the new one, new Secretary of State. So yes, the answer is yes to your question, Homer. It's a great question. Yeah, the dimensions of sustainability are clashing, are conflicting.
Professor May wants to comment.
Yeah, I agree with everything that my friend Marcelo just said, and thinking about how that applies to the United States, one never knows, but there are reasons to be hopeful and reasons to be concerned, and I'll flip that. So the reason to be concerned presently is not just for all the things that we've talked about. The coronavirus is a horrible thing. It's affecting. It's across the world. It's killed hundreds of thousands of people, or more than 100,000 people. There are millions of people infected, and it's had an impact on every aspect of life, on what we do and where we live and what we eat and how we educate and raise our children and how we treat each other and so on. But it also shows that we have this capacity to care for each other. In the United States, we're in an election year. So in November, there is supposed to be an election for who's going to be the next president. And in the United States, much like probably in Brazil, there is typically a ramp up of economic development in election years when you have an incumbent president, when you have a president who's seeking re-election, that is. So my guess is that the Trump administration will do whatever it can to grease the wheels to permit more development, more things that are degrading to the environment. And it's already suspended or retracted or repealed all these environmental laws that would have at least provided for environmental protection during that term. So I think that we're in for a very polluting period in the near future around the election. I think there's going to be a lot of that. So that's a sort of, again, a concern. I don't know if it's the same in Brazil or not.
Thank you. Eloisa Teles asks, speaking in rebirth, the legislation on environmental, how professors think, oops, I lose the question. How professors think could be the main issues should be changed, consider the pandemic effects. Can you see, Marcelo?
Yeah,
questions?
I'm thinking, actually,
Consider.
I don't know. I really don't know. As I said, I think there will be a necessity of rebuilding environmental protection, environmental law, but I don't know in what terms. Actually, we don't know anything that's going to happen. We don't know if how courts will deal with this new situation, because this situation is totally new. As I pointed out, there is a a relevant, a remarkable Supreme Court opinion that dissented from the historical, it's a historical jurisprudence. So I really don't know, Eloisa. We'll have to wait and see. But I think that environmental law will have to readapt itself for what's coming in the near future.
Professor May?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think environmental law will be different going forward for lots of reasons, including the structural reasons that Professor Dantas has mentioned, and that courts will be focused on other matters. You know, that all of a sudden the environment in the United States, just speaking from that perspective, it just doesn't seem to matter much. I don't mean enjoying the environment, I mean protecting it. That, as I mentioned, there are these rollbacks where we're not enforcing the law. I mean, it's the Wild West here now. There aren't inspections. Companies don't have to pay penalties. And in the meantime, we have these, huge bailout from the Congress for the country that's supposed to help put the country back on its feet. But instead, what the numbers show is that the vast majority of the funds that Congress has allocated for this bailout, for this vast economic assistance program, is going to the top 1% of earners in the United States. It's going to corporations. It's going to the fossil fuel industry. It's not going to me. It's not going to people who are not that I am, but people who are most affected, people of color, people in communities of color, the elderly, the infirm, and so on. So it's kind of hard to figure out what the role of environmental law will be going forward. What maybe this is, the opportunity to reimagine what it might be, and to have it be something again that is designed to protect human dignity against, the various assaults against it. It's hard to live a dignified life in a polluted environment, with air that you can't breathe, or water you can't drink, or with lacking biodiversity or ecosystem services, and so on. So one way is to sort of, to change how we, not just how we think about it, but how we feel about it, what's in our heart. There's this expression that if you can change a mind, if you can change a mind, you can change tomorrow. So that's like, what do we do at the end of the pandemic? Or what are we doing now? But if you can change a heart, if you can change a heart, you can change forever. So I'd like to believe that we can change our hearts, and we can change the future, and develop environmental laws that are better suited to advancing the human condition.
Thank you. There is another question formulated by Miguel Ortali. Is the pandemic likely to delay global environmental action efforts? Please, Marcelo.
I think Jimmy has answered somehow, and during the pandemic, maybe by different ways, we reach some goals, but after it ends, or at least after it diminishes its intensity, then probably yes, environmental protection will not be a priority for governments in general, not only the American government, the Brazilian government, which is not already a priority, but around the world, I believe.
Thank you. And also, let me see, Cristiano Albuquerque wants to know, how can the level of education in countries affect how people respond to pandemic? Education. Jimmy? Please.
I don't know. I mean, I'm just sort of I'm a simple person. I don't know how the relationship necessarily between education and the pandemic, but just like about so many things, ignorance induces distrust, distrust induces fear, fear induces reprisal. So I think better education is always better. But in this particular instance, I just don't know what to make of it, because some of the most educated countries on the planet have acted in irregular and odd ways in response to the pandemic, and all sorts of things. Sweden's approach to the coronavirus is very different than the approach in Somalia, is very different than the approach in the United States. So, no degree of education has led to uniformity of responses.
Professor Marcelo?
Yes, well, Cristiano is a very close friend and from my youth, and as he knows, we have one of these multiple groups of WhatsApp of friends, and we disagree a lot in this group of what's right and what's wrong, what to do and what not to do, and him and me are usually together defending the restrictions. But what I feel, and you said something about that, is I know it's not very current to invoke Karl Marx, but Karl Marx has a sentence, it's attributed to him at least, where he said something like that. It's not the conscience of man. It's not the conscience of man who defines who he is. On the contrary, what he is defined by his conscience is defined by what he is. Something like that. So it's very different. It's not a kind of education. I think a matter of education to defend one or the other measure to fight the virus. So it's very, let's say, easy for us to say, don't stay at home if you can. But some people don't have what to eat in Somalia, but not only in Somalia, in Rio de Janeiro. So it's hard to say to these people, stay at home, otherwise you'll be infected and people will die because it's hungry. So it's complicated. It's very complicated, I believe. So thank you, Chris, for your question. It's very nice to have you here as well, my friend.
Thank you. Ana Paula Destre Pavan comments and highlights the press published tonight that since Santa Catarina State reopened the commerce, the number of cases tripled. Case of COVID-19, of course.
This is it. This is it. That's probably, and it will keep growing, I think, if the restrictions are left.
Very well. We are nearing to the end of this webinar. Time flew. And I would like to thank the audience for their participation, and the two professors, the speakers, for the brilliant participation and the teachings. Would you like to say anything else, professors? Both, please.
Well, if I could, I just want to thank you for your questions, and it's been just such an honor and a pleasure to be a part of this. And as the names are popping up with the questions, and as I see the list of participants, I'm reminded of all of my friends there, the ones who have visited Delaware Law School, and the ones that I've had the pleasure of spending time with there in Santa Catarina. It's just been wonderful to be in your presence again. Thank you so much and keep in touch.
Thank you. Professor Marcelo?
Well, the same. I'd like to thank Professor Gilson, Professor Jimmy, and the others that are here with us and the audience. I think we had a great discussion, a great debate, and a deep one. I'm sure at least we will keep thinking on these important and relevant issues. And I'd like to invite you all for next week for our third series of this webinar, this law in the COVID-19. We'll talk about business and regulation with Professor Paul Reagan from Delaware Law School, who has attended this evening, and I thank you, Paul, as well, and Professor Osvaldo Agrippino from Univali. So thank you very, very much, and you have a great night.
Thank you so much, professors, students, alumni, professors, colleagues, friends. Goodbye until next month. Bye-bye. Be happy.
See you then. Bye-bye.
And take care.
Everyone.
Bye. Thank you, friends.